Welcome to the Week 8 edition of Injury Report Live. I am Steve Buchanan with you every week here, 3 p.m. Eastern, on DraftKings Network, on YouTube, wherever you're watching this show. But a little different this week. This week, I'm not with the lovely Megan Townsley. I am with the slightly above average Garion Thorne. Garion Thorne, welcome, my friend. Welcome to Injury Report Live this week.
Happy to be here, man. I mean, I'm in here causing tech issues. I'm clearly not as lovely as Megan Townsley, but you know what? The information is going to be good. I can promise the people that.
Yeah, the looks are average. The information is perfection, and that's what we're going to be dishing out here for Injury Report Live. We have plenty to get to this week, Gary. And, past couple weeks have been pretty heavy for injuries. This week, I feel like it's not as bad, but there are some important injuries that we need to get to this week. Last couple weeks, I feel like it's been a lot of, small ones here and there, not overly affecting your lineup construction. But I think this week in particular is going to be a lot of guys that have injuries or kind of the fallout from those injuries that we're going to discuss. And let's start with the quarterback position because there's two key injuries I want to get to right off the jump here. And let's start with Jayden Daniels, who's going to be going up against the Chicago Bears. It has officially been announced, Gary, that he is going to be a game time decision, which is probably the worst case scenario for at this point here, because it's somebody that's, one of the more expensive quarterbacks on the slate this week, $7,300 for Jayden Daniels. And he's dealing with a rib injury, which really is just going to probably affect everything, the run, him throwing, his ability to throw downfield if he's even able to. But at this point, did not practice Wednesday and Thursday. I believe he was on the practice field or will be expected to be on the practice field here today. So what are your thoughts here? Because at least from what we saw in relief last week, Marcus Mariota looked pretty good in relief of Jayden Daniels. It wasn't, as bad as I thought it was going to be. He was very accurate when he had to throw. McLaurin, Zacchaeus really were his top targets, followed by Zach Ertz. If Jayden Daniels ends up being active, would you feel comfortable using him? Because at least for me, if it was maybe some different injuries, I'd be okay with it. But ribs worries me a lot.
Yeah, for a quarterback, that's a pretty concerning injury for a lot of the reasons you talked about. I mean, not only is it affecting your ability to throw the ball, but as a quarterback, there might not be an area of your body aside from, I guess, your head. And that's a guy we'll talk about in a little bit. But your rib cage constantly gets exposed to defenders. And right. That feels like an injury that could maybe even be re-aggravated pretty easily. I mean, the Commanders are a surprising 5-2. I think they've kind of taken the league by storm. I think even their biggest supporters and fans would say this has been an amazing start. And I feel like with a quarterback like Jayden Daniels, who is not only the key to your offense this season, but is the key to your franchise, maybe you take it a little easy. He was limited in practice today. The Commanders were trying to be a little cute. They had all the quarterbacks practicing in the bubble at their practice facility, so the reporters couldn't see what was going on. Daniels didn't immediately take the field when the other quarterback showed up, but then it was stated after practice that he was limited. He talked to the media and said that if it was his decision, he would play this week. So maybe they are kind of leaning towards him playing, or at least he feels like he can play. So maybe we're closer to the probable end of the spectrum than the doubtful end of the spectrum when he inevitably gets listed as questionable in about an hour. But I don't know. I think for me, Daniels has been so fantastic. Like just to put it in perspective for people, he is averaging 0.64 DraftKings fantasy points per dropback. The only two quarterbacks in football who have been better this season are Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. And he's very close to Josh Allen. Like Lamar's in a category all his own, but he's been amazing. And I think the interesting thing when it comes to Washington is they're not exactly a team that's like stacked with skill position players that are just, must starts really aside from Terry McLaurin. So I think regardless of who plays, because as you mentioned, Mariota looked pretty good last week, although the competition was pretty bad. But I think, you just start McLaurin regardless of who's playing quarterback. Maybe Ertz, just because he's a tight end and he's been kind of peppered with targets lately. But aside from that, I don't think you were dying to necessarily play Zacchaeus, even if Jayden Daniels was playing in this game. So I think it's kind of self-contained to those three players, which is nice. I would probably just blindly play Daniels if he's active, regardless of the risk. but that's just a product of how good he's been so far this season.
I mean, you're not playing him like in a cash lineup though, right? Like I feel like he'd be a great tournament option,
Yeah.
especially if that ownership stays suppressed, because at least the last models that I saw, the only quarterback who's looking like they're going to be double digit owned right now is Bo Nix, who's about 11% ownership, at least projected as of right now. That obviously can change a lot between now and Sunday, but the quarterback position seems very spread out in terms of ownership here. So if Jayden Daniels is in, I feel like you kind of answered this already. You'd be fine with him in a tournament lineup.
Yeah, I think tournament specifically, like you said, you probably don't have that trust factor with a cash game lineup. And, there's a lot working against Daniels, even just aside from the injury. We talked briefly about Mariota looking good in week 7. Part of that, I think, is Marcus Mariota is like a perfect backup for the Commanders to have. I love it when a team sort of thinks ahead and has a similar skill set, similar archetype backup quarterback. So you don't really have to change the offense entirely when a new guy comes in. And Mariota can do a lot of the same things Daniels can do at a somewhat lesser level. He's like a C plus Jayden Daniels, I guess. I mean, he was sort of supposed to be Jayden Daniels 10 years ago. So I think Mariota can be all right, but I would also say Carolina is a very different team than the Chicago Bears. Like if you just look at opponent passing yards per attempt so far this season, the Panthers are tied for the worst mark in football, 7.9 opponent yards per passing attempt. The Bears have the 3rd lowest opponent yards per passing attempt. So this is going to be a different animal. I don't think the Commanders are going to score points like they were last week, regardless of who's at quarterback. I think this is going to be a much more stout test against the Bears.
All right, let's talk about the other quarterback news that we got here. It looks like Tua is going to play. He was able to be cleared from the concussion protocol, 6,100 this week, and probably the best matchup you could ask for him to come back, and one of the best matchups you could ask for him to come in. I almost feel like this was done on purpose because you are facing an Arizona Cardinals team that he should absolutely carve up. He is going to have, it's going to feel like hours to throw in the pocket against the Arizona Cardinals, who have no pass rush to talk about at this point. So you're talking about a safe matchup in terms of him being able to throw, a safe matchup in terms of, a pass defense, and you should absolutely be able to beat. I mean, you look at this pass rush here, nobody on that team has logged more than 3 sacks for the whole season. We're on to week 8 at this point, and the leader in sacks on that team has 3 right now. But here's the problem. Tyreek Hill is very excited to have Tua back. So is everybody building their lineups this week. And Tyreek is already projecting to be one of the highest owned players on this slate, over 25% right now. But you are not going to get Tyreek Hill at a cheaper price.
Yeah.
That's the problem. $7K exactly on the nose for Tyreek Hill, who was 8,700 in week 1. What are your thoughts here on Tyreek and Tua? Because, we talk about Jayden Daniels, maybe not a cash game consideration. I would say Tua might be in that same pool, but then when you consider the matchup and if he's actually fully healthy, I mean, that's a stack that you're not going to get this cheap at any point during the season again.
Yeah, I think that's the main point, is this is kind of setting up like a perfect storm where, you never, like you said, you'd never get Tyreek Hill for under $8,000. Like I can't even remember the last time it happened.
Right.
And it's just a product of the poor quarterback play he's had the last 4 or 5 weeks that we now find him in this predicament. I think Tyreek is like, that's how you start a cash game lineup. I just think you put Tyreek in, you don't worry about it beyond that. The question, like you said, is, can he produce to the point where he's going to be worth that massive roster rate in a GPP?
Right.
I mean, look, the Cardinals defense is bad. It's terrible. And their secondary is even a little bit more banged up than it usually is. Their injury report not looking good through Wednesday and Thursday. Sean Murphy Bunting already ruled out for this contest. Like, it's bad. And we're already talking about a team that was giving up, tied with the Panthers, as I mentioned, 7.9 opponent passing yards per pass attempt, most in the NFL. 3rd most DraftKings fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 8th most DraftKings fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. The Dolphins should be able to move the football. I do think it is maybe not revisionist history, but I think we are kind of looking at this Tua situation through a little bit of rose-colored glasses where we're thinking like, oh, the last time Tua was on the field, this Dolphins offense was unstoppable. Tyreek was everywhere. That's kind of true.
Yeah.
Obviously last season, in good weather, which they'll have in this game, they were fantastic. But the Dolphin offense looked a little weird the first 6 quarters of this season when Tua was actually healthy. Tyreek was still able to produce in week 1. He had a massive play in the second half of that game against the Jaguars. But even looking back on that game now, thinking, wow, they really only scored 20 points against the Jaguars? Like, what was going on there? They looked terrible against the Bills. That's kind of always the case. So maybe take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, I'm not saying this is immediately like 200 yards for Tyreek Hill, but I do think it's kind of important to remember just how vital a piece of this offense he was and just how voluminous a piece of this offense he was. First 2 weeks, even when you include the 2 quarters he played without Tua in that week 2 matchup against Buffalo, almost a 28% target rate per route, which was a top 10 rate among all wide receivers in the NFL. Last season, almost a 35% target rate per route. That was like 6 percentage points higher than any other qualified receiver in football. Like when Tua is in the pocket and Tyreek is on the field, there's like a 50% chance he's getting the ball. So I just think that's how you start a cash game lineup. Like I said, I'm probably not too into Tua in terms of like, especially on an island for DFS this week, but you know, there is no way he is scrambling. Like, I know he got a little leaner and thinner this offseason with the like purpose of maybe running and scrambling a little bit. We saw how that worked out. I feel like Mike McDaniel has told him, you do not move out of this pocket. So he is a pretty one-dimensional quarterback from a fantasy perspective, but I just think we simplify it here. Just put Tyreek in a cash game lineup and that's what you got to do.
And not only that, like the need for him to run is probably not even going to be there, right? Like he's not, like we mentioned, like the pass rush for the Cardinals is just almost non-existent so for him to need to, you know, escape from the pocket might not even be there. Let's talk about a team that has just been decimated with injuries, specifically earlier this week with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, losing Mike Evans, losing Chris Godwin, losing their top 2 receivers here. The running back room is banged up. It's looking like Bucky Irving is going to play this week. I believe I just saw right before we went on air.
Report,
But that's been a mess. It's been hard to navigate really who to take at this point. I will say one thing I was able to capitalize on is, you know, how well Rachaad White was looking last week. I grabbed his live rushing yards. That was something to do. I think maybe if you want to do some live in-game bets, especially when you're working with these committees, just see who's looking good, who has the hot hand, and you can take advantage of some of those rushing yards because they're so soft, because, you know, it really kind of spread out between the 3. Whereas, you know, if it was specifically White or specifically Bucky Irving, you're going to see a lot higher numbers. So just something to consider there. But we have Godwin out for the year. Dislocated ankle. We have Mike Evans out for multiple weeks, is sounding like. So now we have a wide receiver group that once was so strong, so dominant, now includes the like of Sterling Shepard, who, by the way, I didn't even know he was on the Buccaneers a couple weeks ago.
Good for him for being in the league, man. I did not know.
He made a catch and they said Sterling Shepard, and I was like, what? Since when? So we got Sterling Shepard, we got Jalen McMillan, and we got Trey Palmer here trying to figure out who's going to be the 1, 2, 3 in this lineup. I'm just going to go totally off the board here. I think these targets might flow through Cade Otton. For him to have 100 yards in that game last week, which, by the way, included Chris Godwin for 98% of that game, for him to make 8 catches for 100 yards, and now he's going up against a Falcons team that, you know, hasn't exactly been too strong against the tight ends. They haven't allowed a touchdown yet, but Otton seeing the 3rd most red zone targets in the league amongst all tight ends. I kind of feel like I want to play Otton this week and not even bother trying to figure out between Shepard, Millen, and Palmer.
No, I think it's a great pivot. You know, Otton is someone who, even before all this injury craziness, like, let's say hypothetically we're living in a world where Mike Evans is playing this week and Chris Godwin is playing this week, I still think Cade Otton was someone who was worthy of being discussed or starting to be discussed as like a breakout candidate at the tight end position. If you go back to the beginning of week 3, there is only one tight end in football, Brock Bowers, who has just been absolutely peppered with targets in Las Vegas.
Yep.
He is the only guy with more targets and more receptions than Cade Otton in that 5-week span. That's insane. That's insane for a guy who is playing alongside 2 of the top 20 receivers in the NFL. And it speaks to really how much this Tampa Bay offense loves to pass the football. Now, that philosophy might change a little bit depending on the, positional strength they have in that wide receiver room and on that wide receiver depth chart. But, we're talking about a team that leads the NFL in passing touchdowns per game, 2.6 passing touchdowns per game. Maybe that does go down now that you don't have Mike Evans in the red zone. But like you said, Cade Otton has been that guy aside from Mike Evans in the red zone. So maybe Baker Mayfield only throws for 2 touchdowns this week because, not healthy, not full at those skill positions. But I would almost guarantee if he throws 2 this week, 1 is going to be to Cade Otton.
If you had to choose, though, between those 3, I'm probably going to side with Sterling Shepard amongst the 3. And the only reason I say that is because Sterling Shepard throughout his career, specifically when he was with the Giants, he was a slot receiver. I mean, that's really where the majority of his snaps came out of. Now, that hasn't happened with the Bucs, but I think that also has a lot to do with, well, you have Chris Godwin in the slot, so why are you going to put Sterling Shepard in the slot? Because if you look at his snap breakdown, 64% out wide, 33% in the slot. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a little 180 on those 2 and Sterling Shepard becomes your slot receiver. And if that is the case, and again, I don't know, I am purely guessing, unless we receive a report where like we have definitive roles, I don't think we're going to know until that game starts. But if I had to guess, at least for me, Shepard in the slot kind of feels like it makes sense. So that's who I would go with. I'm not excited to play him. I don't know if I'm really going to play him much, but if you had to choose between the 3, it's Shepard for me at least. Do you have any thoughts on that or any opinions?
So I think it's obviously a little different depending on if we're talking DFS, if we're talking season long. But I do think for DFS specifically, Shepard is probably the guy you want to go with, just because the perception I have right now is that Shepard is the person drawing the least amount of excitement among people who want to make lineups. One, look, we're not talking giant amounts of money here, but he is the most expensive of the 3. So immediately your eye is drawn to Trey Palmer just because he's so cheap at $3,500. And then if we go by just who's been driving conversation, who's been driving like Google alerts this week, who everyone was spending their fab money on, it was McMillan. People were more excited about Jalen McMillan. And maybe that's just as simple as he had 8 targets in that game. And people see a big number like that, and they immediately think that's what's going to carry over week to week. And they could be right. Maybe he does end up being that number 1 option. But I think at the end of the day, when we stare at ownership rates, once this game starts, I have a very strong feeling that Shepard is going to be the least owned of the 3. And maybe part of that is even as simple as, Steve, sometimes we have to be psychologists in this business.
Sure.
The sort of allure of the unknown, like, oh, McMillan, upside. Never heard of that guy. Trey Palmer's got upside too. I know what Sterling Shepard is. Like, it's not exciting. And that's kind of how people think. They're like, they want that upside of the unknown. Shepard is very known. We know who Sterling Shepard is at this point. That might be fine, especially in a full point PPR setting. Like, if he ends up with 6 catches, maybe it's for 55 yards, but at that price point, perfectly fine. Like, you're looking at 4x value at that point. So I'm with you. I think that might be the zag when everyone's going with those other 2 slightly cheaper receivers.
So just looking at projected ownerships for those 3 guys, McMillan is at 13%. Palmer is at 7%. Shepard is at 0.5.
There we go.
So there you go. You were right on it. It's the psychologist in you is
put on my glasses, my smart guy glasses at some point.
All right, let's move on to Zay Flowers here. This was really odd, by the way, the other day. So Flowers gets basically rolled up on the field, like crawled to the sidelines in a ton of pain. But then he was on the field for the rest of the game, but didn't receive, I think, 1 target after that. So it was weird. It's like, were they using him as a decoy? Because he still ended up logging 44 snaps, but it didn't feel like it at all because it felt like he was out of this game. I had to go back and check like what his snap share was. And I was like, he was really on the field that much. It didn't feel like it at all. So like, maybe it was just more of a decoy thing. And then he logs no practice on Wednesday, no practice on Thursday, was on the practice field today. So maybe, there is a good chance that he's going to end up playing this week. But I'll tell you, if there's anybody specifically that I want healthy this week, it is Zay Flowers. This is a massive matchup for Zay Flowers when you look at some of the guys he's going to go up against in coverage for Cleveland here with like Newsome and Ward. Newsome allowing 15.5 yards per reception on 21 catches so far this year. Cleveland has two guys in coverage in that secondary that have allowed over 15 yards per reception. Both of those guys are in the top 10 in the league for yards per reception, some of those corners that they have going there. So I want Zay Flowers healthy for this game at 6,800. And obviously the ankle injury is something you have to worry about, especially, for a wide receiver or whatnot. But my goodness, I feel like this is one of those spots where like we could easily see 100+ yards from Zay Flowers. The Ravens are just rolling right now. And the best part about this is that this actually might be somewhat of a competitive game now because we have Jameis Winston under center for Cleveland. We finally get a freaking quarterback under center with the Cleveland Browns. Like, this is the best case scenario. So maybe this game isn't a total blowout and Flowers isn't even utilized in the second half. So I'm really hoping all the stars align, but give me your thoughts here on Zay Flowers.
I mean, like you said, it's a smash spot. And you're right, too. I think that Cleveland's offense has been so ridiculously terrible so far this season that it's almost to the detriment. I mean, they've almost turned into one of the worst fantasy matchups possible because, their defense is not nearly as good as it was last season, but clearly the better part of this team. And with the offense being completely uncompetitive, you would just get into situations where, you never have a barn burner. You never have a game where just points are being scored on both sides. Jameis Winston's middle name is Barn Burner. This guy loves throwing 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions in the same game. So that could definitely be very fun for this. Obviously, Flowers is just someone who you're watching for that injury report. You're watching for those Saturday night updates. And if he's available, you play him. I think it's just that simple. Obviously, you're going to have some concerns. The ankle isn't 100%. But at this point, with the way Lamar Jackson is looking, any aspect of this Baltimore offense that you can put into a lineup, I think there's a case to be made that you should. I mean, even let's talk Rashad Bateman, just in the possibility that Zay Flowers doesn't play in this game. I think suddenly you get into a situation where Bateman might be as highly owned as Tyreek Hill just because his price point is so low, $4,300, despite the fact he's been pretty heavily utilized in this offense the last 3 weeks. I know there was some, skepticism about his role the first couple weeks of the season. Lamar wasn't really firing on all cylinders. The Ravens obviously started the season with a couple losses, but right now this offense looks unstoppable. And I will say these Bateman stats, you kind of have to go at some point, these are going to normalize. Like, you just can't be this efficient with his specific type of route tree for this long. But since week 4, 77% catch rate on a 15-yard ADOT. He's averaging 16.1 yards per target, which is the most of any wide receiver in the NFL in that span that has at least 10 catches. He is the definition of a big play waiting to happen, especially in this offense that is just so predicated on big plays with Lamar under center. Again, is he going to be able to do that every single week? Probably not. But like you were talking about, this specific matchup against this secondary that has just bled big plays all season long, it seems like Bateman's in a dream spot. I would actually say if you're someone who's looking to roster Bateman this week, you probably want Zay Flowers to play because it's going to keep way more people off of him.
No, that was the next point I was going to make, is that do we play Bateman even if Flowers is active? And like, I feel like this would be like such a classic letdown spot because, we get back-to-back weeks of those huge production. Now people are like, oh, now people are going to start, getting his attention. But even right now with, Flowers in, Bateman only has 4% projected ownership right now. That's crazy to me. That is crazy low. Because now I'm like, all right, well, what am I missing then that he's still not getting the attention? Is it because of Flowers? Potentially. But if I'm making a lineup, especially in a tournament, all signs are to Bateman here, regardless of if Flowers is in or not, because Flowers is going to garner a ton of attention when it comes to roster construction because of how good he's been, because of this matchup here. So I think that Bateman is probably this, I don't want to say the stronger tournament play, but the smarter tournament play, I guess is how you would describe that.
Well, you're just going to have like people watching Flowers for the rest of, right up until kickoff. He's going to be the name that people are talking about. People are excited about the Mark Andrews renaissance. He's like been okay for 2 weeks. The target share still really isn't there, but he's at least getting into the end zone. So maybe it's, again, a case of just Bateman still being overshadowed in this offense, which, like you're saying, needs to be rectified because he's been really, really good for a month.
All right, let's talk about DK Metcalf. This is sounding more like he's not going to play in this game here. They were kind of in the beginning of the week, they're saying he's going to be week to week. They were going to reevaluate him today, so we'll get probably official or close to official word on what his status is going to be. But even if he's active, this is one of those scenarios where I think I don't really concern myself much with Metcalf. I don't think I would play Metcalf even if he's fully healthy against the Bills. The Bills secondary has been pretty solid, but the way to beat the Bills through the air, at least from what we've seen thus far, has been by slot receivers. So that would be Jackson Smith Njigba, who I think is in a really good spot here. So even if Metcalf was active, he's only played 14% of his snaps in the slot. So that's not an area that you're really going to be targeting him anyways. But you look at Teron Johnson, who just came back the other week in coverage, specifically when he's going up against slot receivers. He's allowing a 78% catch rate, 11.8 yards per reception. He's only played in 3 games, but this feels like a really good spot to pivot to Jackson Smith-Njigba because when you hear that DK Metcalf is out, you're going to automatically go, oh, this is going to be a Tyler Lockett week. This is not a Tyler Lockett week, in my opinion. I think this is a bad spot for him, and I think a lot of people are going to kind of fall into that trap. I think it's a JSN week, quite frankly.
Yeah, this is one of those weird injuries where, not to sound boring and let people down, but there's no sexy alternative here. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
this isn't one of those spots where it's like, oh, top wide receiver injured. You gotta get Jake Bobo in those lineups, buddy. It's gotta happen. He's gonna have a huge week. Now look, Bobo has made some crazy catches before, so who knows? He might catch a crazy touchdown in the back of the end zone, and my face is red coming into next week. But this, to me, just sort of simplifies this Seattle offense, which has kind of been, I still feel like when I think of Seattle, I think of Marshawn Lynch. I think of the times that we would spend begging to let Russ cook, which seems so cringy in retrospect now.
Yes.
But we were always asking, come on, let's have a Seattle offense, modernize this thing. Let's throw the football a little bit. They're finally doing that. I mean,
Yep.
They are passing the ball at an absurd rate so far this season. 66.5% of their offensive plays have been passes, by far the highest mark in the NFL. So it's really one of those situations where when you have 3 wide receivers like DK, like JSN, like Lockett, I think there's been a little bit of negativity towards Lockett so far this season. Part of this could also just be that he's reaching that point in his career where he's a little older. He's probably not quite elite anymore. Some of those skill sets are slowing a little bit, but this is a guy who's still top 25 in the league in targets, which is insane. They've been able to support 3 different wide receivers in the top 25 of targets among wide receivers. And it's just because they throw the ball as much as they do. So with one of those guys likely stepping out with DK, it just kind of simplifies things. It just goes, okay, JSN's going to have a massive day. And like you said, this isn't the best matchup for Lockett necessarily, but I still think he's going to see somewhere between 7 to 9 targets, maybe more, just based on how much they have to throw the football. And this is a game that we could see getting into a situation where Seattle's just got to spend the second half throwing the football because they're down to Buffalo. High scoring environment. At least that's the sense that I get. This could just be an offensive paradise for those 2 wide receivers. But I'm with you. I think JSN is the guy I'd rather have in my lineups. But if you're someone who's sitting with Tyler Lockett in the season long, I don't think that's a situation I'm going to be depressed about.
And the thing I also like about JSN is I feel like he's kind of in no man's land when it comes to salary here. 6,100, which doesn't make him cheap, doesn't make him expensive. He's just kind of in the middle. And you look at some of the guys that are surrounding him, it's like, would you choose JSN or would you go with Amari Cooper for the second week with Buffalo now going against Seattle? Or maybe Tank Dell, who's playing without not Stephon Diggs, without Nico Collins.
Yep.
He kind of falls in that area where it's very gray and there's not going to be a lot of eyeballs in that range. Because if you're kind of in that range, it's like, okay, if I go up a little bit more, there's a lot more enticing names or enticing matchups like Brian Thomas Jr. going up against the Packers. I probably want to go there. So I think JSN is one of those sneaky, really owned tournament plays this week, especially if Metcalf is out. But you know what? If Metcalf is in, even better. The ownership is going to be next to nil for JSN in that case. But I think JSN is slowly becoming one of my more favorite plays on the week and someone I'm going to be keeping an eye on, but we'll kind of keep our ears to the ground there for the Metcalf news as this goes on. Let's get some more news that we had here. Chris Olave looking like he's going to play this week. He was able to get through the concussion protocol. And you want to talk about another team that is just a mess offensively. The Saints are one of them. They've kind of joined the Buccaneers. We thought the Buccaneers were bad. The Saints are right up there with them. So Chris Olave is most likely going to be playing this week. Is Cedric Wilson out, by the way? I saw something from him almost right when we came out. Did you see that officially? I think he's out this week now as well.
Yeah, I didn't see it officially, but I know he popped up on Thursday, which is never a good sign.
Right.
Yeah, which God, they just have nothing left. It's crazy.
So if you just go by the target breakdown from what we saw last week, Tipton was your lead target getter last week with 9. Cedric Wilson, who we're not sure if he's going to be playing or not, was at 7. Juwan Johnson with 6. Kamara, who's dealing with a broken hand, by the way, and busted ribs, he had 7. And then Means, everybody was on. That's where everybody thought the targets were going to flow through. Was Bub Means was probably one of the bigger disappointments last week. But my goodness, this Saints team is a mess right now. But were you looking to play any Saints this week? Because going against the Chargers, not one of the best matchups for sure. Spencer Rattler's under center. Like, what a mess. I feel like this is an easy, move on, want nothing to do with. But, if you have another opinion, let me know. But I think the Saints I'm steering clear completely from the Saints this week, even for someone like Johnson.
I think in a general sense, I'm with you. I think Olave is a guy in season long who unfortunately just kind of have to start, but that being said, if you do want to take a chance in a GPP and play Olave on an island, just knowing that he's probably going to get like a 30% target share, knowing that the Saints are probably going to spend a majority of this game passing the football and playing from behind. The issue though with the matchup, it's not just that the Chargers have been really, really good against opposing passing games so far this season, like only allowing 184 opponent passing yards per game. That's 10th fewest in the NFL. We just saw the Chiefs not have like a fantastic Chief-like game against the Chargers. Like, they're pretty good in the defensive end of things. This is also a case where Harbaugh and the offense is impacting opposing teams' offenses because they are so deliberate and so slow moving the ball down the field. Like, Justin Herbert is just handing that puppy off, sitting back and doing absolutely nothing, which I know it's sad to a lot of us who love Justin Herbert, but that's Harbaugh ball. That's what they want to do. Yep. The results of that is just no time of possession for the opposing team. And we see that play out in average plays per game. The Chargers' opponents only averaging 56 offensive plays per game, the second fewest of any team in the NFL so far this season. So you're already in a situation where we're not expecting much. Like, the implied point total for this Saints team is incredibly low in week 8. And now you're like saying, yeah, you might only have 50 plays too. So even if we are talking about a 30% target rate for Chris Olave, suddenly that's not 13 targets, it's 8 targets. And those targets are coming from Spencer Rattler, who looked terrible on Thursday Night Football. Now, I think you could make the case just from a variance perspective and a volume perspective that Olave could be used in a GPP. But I think in a general sense, I'm with you, Steve. I'm so underwhelmed by this team. I just feel like they're not going to be able to score at all. So at a certain point, where's the upside?
Yeah, because we're talking about 6,400 for this guy this week for somebody who's combined to score 3.5 DraftKings fantasy points for the last 2 weeks. Granted, he was hurt in week 6, so we can't hold that against him. But that's kind of what we've been dealing with him with Rattler under center, and then we're getting this here today. So I'm with you. Like, I get the volume sense. You see his props here for this week. 4.5 is the over under on his receptions. 49.5 yards for his receiving yards, which is crazy low in the grand scheme of things for Chris Olave, because we've seen him go over that in one catch before with Derek Carr. But I even in a tournament, I can't justify it. Like, I think I would be lucky for him to 2x his salary this week. And I think that might be a stretch, right? For him to get 13, 14 points. I feel like that's a big ask. Like, he needs to score first and foremost. And then he needs to collect maybe 5 catches after that. So, maybe a play for the over. But this just feels like a really tough spot to really justify Olave. I think this is one of those that, unfortunately, the circumstances that surround him, him in this offense, imagine him with Derek Carr, right? And all of these injuries. Olave, despite the matchup, would be a huge play this week. But with the backup quarterback as well, I can't do it and it's unfortunate because, again, this is a situation where you dream about taking advantage of is getting your solidified wide receiver one in an offense where there are so many injuries behind that. This guy's going to get fed targets. That is probably going to be the case here this week. But the guy who's throwing him the ball is throwing him some really crap targets in the meantime. So, I just think it's just not going to work out for me this week. I don't think I can't imagine myself having any ownership of Olave this week.
This could be one of those situations where we look back and it's like, wow, Chris Olave had 210 air yards. And you're like, well, how many receiving yards did he have? I like 16, but God, the air yards though.
Right. I mean, look, if Chris Olave beats me this week, hands up, I was wrong. What are you, a cop? I mean, it is what it is. One more injury I want to get to is the Deontay Johnson news for the Carolina Panthers. I just feel like they are trying on purpose now to just decimate any confidence that Bryce Young has, because the dude is finally going to start again because Andy Dalton's looking like he's not going to play. And now we have Bryce Young with no offense once again going up against one of the best defensive teams in the league and the Denver Broncos, and they are just throwing him out to the Wolves once again. I mean, what do we got? Xavier Legette is our wide receiver one this week, that's probably what it's looking like, because no Adam Thielen, of course, because he's still on the IR. That was really Bryce Young's security blanket last year. So now we're talking about, Legette at $5K, Jalen Coker at $3,100, Jonathan Mingo at $3,400. Want nothing to do with that. If there's anybody I'm playing on the Panthers this week, and this is actually a play that I've really kind of talked myself into, I'm probably playing Jontavian Sanders at tight end at $3,100. Looking like no Tommy Tremble, so that's a good thing here. Denver's allowed about 12 DraftKings fantasy points to the tight end position. Always take that with a grain of salt because, to me, it's like what opposing defenses allow to tight ends is so finicky because some teams just simply don't use the tight end position. So, and some do. So you can't really say, they've been good or not against a tight end. But I need to make a case here. Sanders is $3,100. There's no one else to throw to. Bryce Young's probably going to be running for his life once again. And if he's not dumping him off to, Chuba Hubbard or something, Sanders feels like a good choice. So you need to save a tight end. I'm always paying down at tight end. Sanders is probably my guy this week.
It's just like a good time to remember how people were probably talking about Deontay Johnson on Wednesday and on Thursday when, this has been a pretty similar sort of narrative for him or script throughout the week. Like, I don't think he's practiced on a Wednesday in a month. He generally doesn't practice on Thursdays either. So it's been a lot of like, okay, he wasn't practicing Wednesday. He wasn't practicing Thursday. I'm sure he's still going to play because he always plays. And now he's ruled out. But on Wednesday, I remember talking to people going, well, even if Deontay Johnson plays, like, I don't even know if I want to play him.
Right.
And we're talking about someone who's like among the league leaders in red zone targets, massive target share overall. And you're still like, I don't know, man, if Bryce Young's involved in this, this is like, Britta's in this. Ugh. Like, I just don't want anything to do with Bryce Young. It's looked so bad.
Yeah.
And I think your point to like, are they trying to set this guy up to fail? I think it's kind of interesting. Like, that's maybe the one thing or the one angle that I have a little bit of curiosity about is, and I know Canales was even asked this question when he was doing a media scrum a couple hours ago, which was, are you purposefully holding Deontay Johnson out to keep him healthy ahead of the trade deadline?
Sure.
So if you're in a season-long format, for as much as we're making it seem like everything involved in this is totally disgusting and you don't want to touch it at all, if you've got a roster spot that you're not super happy with right now, that you feel is kind of like, meh, whatever, and you want a little bit of upside, I think like Jalen Coker, if you're in a deep league, Xavier Legette, obviously, if you're in a shallower format, but give those guys an ad because there's seriously a chance that Deontay Johnson just isn't on this Panthers squad next week.
It's a great point.
And suddenly you've just got, I know it's a wide receiver one for the Panthers, but hey, it's a wide receiver one that might be free right now. So that could be a situation to look out for, especially if, I think we all thought that Bryce Young was going to get handed the keys back to this offense at some point. I mean, if you're the Panthers, what are you trying to accomplish this season? I think you have to know what you have definitively in Bryce Young by the end of this season. I think we all think we know what that answer is going to be, but I think as an organization, you need to know what it is. So you might as well get this guy to play. So we thought he'd be back at some point, but I think this was sort of a situation where their hand was pushed by Andy Dalton's thumb in this car accident. Dalton might be back next week. And I know the offense hasn't looked fantastic the last two, but it still definitely looked better with Andy Dalton under center than it has with Bryce Young. So again, if we're projecting this forward, maybe a Coker is worth a stash right now. Maybe a Leggett is worth a stash right now. In terms of this week against, like, man, giving Bryce Young the Broncos is really, really mean. This is a defense that has been fantastic against the pass. And yes, they've had some easier matchups. They were able to pad their stats last week against Spencer Rattler, but I think the exact same situation is going to play out this Sunday. Like 5.2 opponent yards per passing attempt, best in the NFL. I just don't see the Panthers being able to move this football. I don't mind playing the tight end. I think that's, tight end is a pretty easy position to sell me on virtually anyone. But yeah, in terms of Leggett's $5,000 too. It's not like you're getting this guy at 3.8. He's not Sterling Shepard. I just think there's not a lot of value here. I don't think I was that interested in Deontay Johnson to begin with. So it's hard for me to be like, oh yeah, I'm interested in worse Deontay Johnson, Xavier Leggett.
I will say though, in terms of when you're building your DraftKings lineups this week, ownership for defense is something you really need to watch because, you can save a lot of salary. You can, really differentiate yourself from the field. The Bears defense, at least as of now, is dominating the ownership, almost 20% coming into this week. The Broncos, when you look at some of the top owned defenses for this upcoming week, are nowhere to be found, not even in the top 10, which is crazy to me. Now they're expensive.
Yeah.
3,700. So there is that. But you talk about a matchup where they could walk away with 15, 20 DraftKings fantasy points. That is a realistic thing that could happen in this game between the turnovers, the lack of scoring. I mean, you're talking about a Panthers offense that, their best offensive player that is taking the field is going to be scripted out of this game probably by the second quarter. So, I mean, and that also takes into account that the Denver can score, which has been an issue. So don't get me wrong, but the Panthers have also been so bad defensively as well. There's really nothing that you can concur that you can say in a positive manner for the Panthers. So just keep an eye on the Denver defense, the ownership as it goes along. Because listen, I'm not the first one that wants to pay up for defense. If you're going to give them to me at 2 to 3% ownership, I will find a way to give them $3,700 and put them in that lineup because they could outscore some of these value plays at the wide receiver position or the tight end position. They could easily outscore some of these value plays that are being touted for the week. So just keep an eye on that as the weekend progresses. Real quick, I don't really want to talk about the 49ers too much because we're not going to get an injury report here, an updated one before the show closes. And there is just so many injuries to try to consider that I would not feel right trying to say, oh, do this or do that, because the entire offense is on the injury report right now, even without Ayuk. I mean, you got Kittle on there, you got Jennings on there, you got Debo on there. So there's a lot of injuries to consider, but I don't really want to give out any information on this because a lot's going to change by the time that we sign off and then we get this clip out. It's probably not even going to be relevant at this point. But did you have any comments or anything on that? Because obviously the matchup against Dallas is great. We want some of these guys to be healthy, but it is such a mess right now that I don't feel right saying this is a guy to play or this is a guy to fade.
Yeah, I would say we did get semi-definitive news on Juwan Jennings this morning.
Yes.
It seems like he, of the three that we're kind of keeping our eye on, is definitely trending in the wrong direction. He's going to be listed as doubtful. They were pretty clear about that. He's probably going to miss his second consecutive game. I mean, look, Debo was back at practice on Thursday. So was Kittle. I'm not saying this is set in stone, but that's generally a pretty positive sign that they're going to play this weekend. And if you get into a situation where Debo's active, Kittle's active, and Pearsall's active, that's kind of just it, right? You can't, I think once you have three pretty set in stone top receiving targets, you're not going to want to really go dumpster diving with the Bells of the world. I just think that's pretty set in stone. Again, this could all change, but yeah, Jennings is the one that I think we can say pretty clearly as of now is not looking good.
And I would say if there's anybody to benefit the most from Ayuk is probably Jennings because, Ayuk hasn't been a big difference maker in this offense or anything like that. It's been pretty quiet overall for somebody who gave us so much crap over the offseason. We're like, this is what you made everybody worried about it and go hoopla about. This is what came out of this. Yeah, that one game in week 2, I think it was, and then that was it. So I don't feel like there's like a big trickle down effect in terms of, who's going to benefit the most. Like Kittle and Debo will get an extra couple targets here and there, but I don't feel like anyone stands out as like, oh, we got a roster X because Ayuk is out at this point.
Yeah, I think Pearsall is interesting just because, again, he's a highly touted player, lots of upside as a former first round pick. But yeah, I think you're right. I think once we get Jawan Jennings back, we've already seen what he can kind of. He's an elite. I rarely use this term, but I used it earlier this year when it came to Jennings. He's one of the few elite wide receiver handcuffs I can think about. Like He was a guy who I was willing to like use a roster spot for in a season-long league, banking on a team that often does get injured, banking on Ayuk or Debo getting hurt, and then saying like, hey, Jennings not only has an amazing situation to be a handcuff where constantly the starters in this offense are getting hurt, but he's also really good and tends to produce when he gets that opportunity. So that's something we'll probably have to talk about more in week 9 because he is going to be doubtful. But yeah, I think Pearsall's got some interest, but this is going to be like Jawan, Debo, and George, and I think that's pretty clear.
All right, so usually when I'm with Megan, this is where we'll end the show, but I'm with you, and what are you betting on the MLB tonight?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I'm riding with the Yankees. It hurts me.
Oh, no!
But I am going to ride with the Yankees. I really think the Freddie Freeman thing is throwing me. I just think we're kind of in a situation where that lineup for the Dodgers, as crazy as this sounds, because it starts Shohei Ohtani, Mookie Betts.
Yeah.
But when you lose Freddie Freeman or he's not at 100%, it gets short fast. Obviously, this is going to be like sacrilege because the man just won National League Championship Series MVP. But if Tommy Edmonds ever hitting cleanup for you, that's a bit of a problem. And he was in a dream matchup in the Championship League Series because the Mets just throw left-handed starters at you constantly.
Right.
The Yankees are not going to do that. And I think he's going to be a non-factor in this series. I just think the Yankees have better starting pitching. Like, if we're talking about a game 3 where you've got, Clark Schmidt or Luis Heel going up against the husk of Walker Buehler and then a bullpen game for game 4.
Yeah.
Again, the Dodgers are so top heavy. It's crazy to talk about this, but that once you get past the top 5 names on that roster, it gets a little mid.
No, I'm with you. I totally agree. I do think for tonight, and I already saw it moved. I do have the over 8.5. It is at 9 now, which I was not surprised about. That's been inching up there as the day goes on. But dude, I think Jack Flaherty is just cooked at this point. I think he's totally gassed. This is like the most innings he's thrown in about 4 or 5 years now. I think he's just absolutely
not striking out
gassed.
Anyone in the playoffs.
Yeah. And and his fastball velocity has been down a little bit. Like I think he's done so. So between that and Cole with his like unusual command, I think we're getting a lot of runs here tonight.
And you've got Garrett Cole on like 10 days rest. Like I know he's also not been striking out guys in the playoffs, but let's not overlook that. He is well rested coming into the playoff series.
All right, so that is going to be your baseball bets here for NFL Injury Report Live. We had to sneak that in there. Don't care. Clip that up. That was good stuff there. But that is going to do it for the Week 8 edition of Injury Report Live. I want to thank Gary and Thorne for joining in here and filling in for Megan Townsley, who I believe will be back next week. But Gary is a great addition to the show, so we'll hope to have you back here before the season is over. For Gary and Thorne, I am Steve Buchanan. We will see you right here once again, 3 p.m. Eastern, Fridays, Injury Report Live on DraftKings Network. Catch you next week.